Good morning, everyone. How are we all this morning?
Good. Here.
Hi.
Right? Right. Well, it's another beautiful morning. So I got something a bit more improvisational for us this morning, and everyone else who's gone will just watch the recording later. So, so with that, I had an idea, and so I'm a big believer in not making too much work for myself.
I agree with that.
So what it is like I'm gonna go off, and we're gonna kind of do some kind of like storytelling beats, storytelling moment. So, and luckily it's already been written for me, and then we're just gonna kind of talk about like what it means. So I want us to like just to get into the mood of storytelling. So the thing is like when it comes to stories, there is always a certain sense of mode. There's just ways that people do stories, like around a campfire is one of those just very natural moments where that sort of happens. And we wonder why. It's like, well, one, there's no distraction. There's no distraction. No one's like checking their phone or like, looking at their watch or anything like that. There's a sense where the space has to be maybe not necessarily prepared, but it's a place where you can easily be listened to, and I think whenever you're on a campfire, it's like that, the stars are out, the fire is kind of like everyone's centrally, around this, burning object. So in that, I just noticed that, people just do it, right? Like we just have an instinct for it. And I think I was rereading, this essay by Francis Schaeffer, and he was a little bit before my generation, but he was very instrumental in the 60s, just kind of a new cultural understanding of Christianity. Because I think a lot of times we're, as I was talking about last week, very theological, very, very kind of, I'm trying to remember that older way, a personality, or right side of the brain, they're very much there, right? Very logical, very reasonable. But he wrote this essay called Art in the Bible. And I was just thinking about, I marked some of the zingers. I think the first point he makes is that God is interested in beauty. I don't think we often think about that, but we just notice that there is something about beauty that is universal. And the fact that humans desire to make beautiful things. Even if there's a very strangeness to them, there's a cultural aesthetic that comes on through. So I think like stories are really, it's almost kind of the low bar, not low bar as like, oh, it's not worthwhile, but low bar in the sense of where it's accessible, because we can listen to other cultural stories. We can listen to them and we can almost understand them. I think there always is a little bit of a lens. There is always a little bit of a misunderstanding, that, or you can actually say the same thing, but say it in a different way. I think one of my favorite examples is it's a very, very beautiful, but very sad film called The Grave of the Fireflies. And it was one of Studio Ghibli, very famous Japanese animation studio that did it. And it's on the list of like one of the saddest movies ever made. And why? And well, what happens in the movie is that these kids essentially, they survived the firebombing of Kobe, that we did. We burned the Japanese cities, with like, thermite bombs from the air. And the thing is that the children eventually starved to death. But the thing is, it's like, so for us as Americans, like if you read like Roger Ebert's review, his notion is it's an anti-war film because it just shows the brutality of war. But that's not true if you talk to a Japanese audience about the film. Because the Japanese audience is that the kids didn't have to die, but they refused to be humble with their guardian that lived with them, who was very unpleasant and, kind of demanded a certain level of humility and dare say humiliation. But that's how the Japanese view the war. It's the same message, but the villain, the onus of the story is different. So for us as Americans, our view is like, war, big, right? This kind of, we're like, like this is just a bad thing. But the Japanese culturally had to be more specific. And the specificity is like, this is why the war happened. Japan, we literally destroyed ourselves because we thought we were bigger than what we really were. So it's like, it's less direct than how we would approach that sort of storyline. But it's still interpretable. Like we still get the same large message, but the interpretation, that's where we can get to know each other. So that's one of the things that like, so I want to like, this story, we probably heard it before. You've probably heard it before. And since you're, coming here to church, you obviously find it valuable, but we're going to listen to it in a different way. So let's just get ourselves into kind of like that storytelling, mix, that mode. as I read this thing. You get, like just getting over like those summer.
Everybody's
Well,
got.
everybody's got, yeah.
He's got the cough. Okay. Long ago, in the time before all days, before the beginning of all things, the Great Spirit created the spirit world above and the earth below. And at that time, our Mother Earth was an empty wasteland with no form or beauty, and great darkness was over the face of the ancient deep waters. The breath of the Great Spirit moved over the surface of the waters like an eagle brooding over her nest. And Creator sounded his voice. "Let there be light," he said, and light was. And the Great Spirit could see that the light was good, so he separated the light from the darkness. Creator gifted the light with the name day, and the darkness he gave the name night. The night faded, and morning came, the first day. In 6 days, Creator made all things seen and unseen. He made the spirit world above and the earth below. He created spirits to be his messengers and helpers. He also made the sun, moon, and stars, and all plants and animals. He made the great waters and all who swim in them, the winged ones who fly in the sky, the four-legged ones who walk on the ground, every creeping thing that crawls. All were shaped and molded by his hands. And on the sixth day, Creator made the first man and woman and placed them in the garden of beauty and harmony to be caretakers of the earth. On the seventh day, Great Spirit rested from his work of creation, not because he was tired, but because he was finished. The Great Spirit blessed the seventh day and made it a holy day. So humankind was created to enter into his day of rest and remain in harmony with Creator and to care for all of creation. But the evil snake, sometimes called accuser, a spirit being who opposes the Great Spirit, twisted the words of Creator. He planted a seed of doubt into the minds of the first people. So they ate the fruit of the only tree that Creator told them not to eat from, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And by listening to the evil snake and disobeying the maker of life, they brought death with all its bloodshed, violence, and destruction to all generations of humankind that would follow. The life of beauty and harmony was lost, and the circle of life was broken. A powerful curse came upon the ground that affected all living things. Spiritual and physical death would come to all. The hearts of human beings became broken and twisted together with good and evil. They could no longer live in harmony in the land and began to follow evil ways and hurt and kill one another. Have a seat, everyone. Creator revealed what he would come from. Creator revealed what would come from the curse brought about by the ancient snake. Then he made a promise to all of humankind. He promised to one day send another human being, born of a woman, who would crush the head of the ancient snake and restore human beings and all creation back to the life of beauty and harmony again. After many generations, Creator found a man he chose to make a peace treaty with, named Father of Many Nations. Though this man and his descendants, through them, Creator would bring to pass his promise. When Father of Many Nations and his wife were too old to have children, the Great Spirit gave them a son, and they named him He Made Us Laugh, because they laughed when Creator told them that they would have a child. He Made Us Laugh had a son whom he named Heel Grabber, because he grabbed his twin brother's heel when he was being born. The Great Spirit later gave him a new name, Wrestles with Creator, because he wrestled with a spirit messenger from Creator. Wrestles with Creator had 12 sons, who became 12 tribes. After 400 years of mistreatment and slavery in the foreign nation of Blackland, the Great Spirit set them free through Drawn from the Water, who became the great lawgiver of the people. The Great Spirit made a peace treaty with the tribes and gave them their own land of promise, ceremonies to purify them, and feasts to teach them to celebrate his goodness. He also gave them their tribal law, which he carved into tablets of stone, and a sacred tent lodge, where they could perform their ceremonies. Creator wanted to be their only chief, but the tribes wanted a human chief, so they could be like the nations around them. This grieved Creator, but he gave them what they wanted. Most of these chiefs became arrogant, and misrepresented the Great Spirit. But there were a few good ones, and one of these chiefs was much loved one. He had a good heart towards Creator and the people, even though he at times also strayed from the path. Creator chose the tribes to be a light to other nations. They failed to keep his peace treaty. They broke his laws and misrepresented him to others. He sent many prophets to turn the hearts of the tribe back to the right ways of the Great Spirit. But they did not listen, and their hearts became like stone. The tribes went to war with each other and divided into two tribal nations. One nation kept the name Wrestles with Creator, and the other nation took the name Gives Him Honor. After warning them many times, the Great Spirit finally removed his protection from them and allowed them to be conquered by people from the village of confusion. The tribes were taken captive and removed from their homeland. Their sacred lodge was destroyed, and their village of peace was left in ruins. Creator's heart was full of sorrow, but he did not forget his ancient promise. So he sent more holy men to tell about his plan. The Great Spirit spoke through the great prophet lifted by Creator, saying, "Behold, the time will come when I will make a new peace treaty with the northern tribes of Wrestles with Creator and the southern tribes of Give Him Honor. This peace treaty will be different from the one I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand and walked them out of the land of Blackland. They did not honor that peace treaty, so I had to turn away from them. But here is the new peace treaty that I'll make with them. I'll plant my laws in their minds and carve them into their hearts. I will be their Great Spirit, and they will be my people, my sacred family." He also spoke through Creator will help us, saying, "He is the one whom I've chosen, who does all I ask and makes my heart glad. I have made my stand with him and love him as a father loves a son. My sacred spirit will rest on him and give him a message that will right all the wrongs done to all people. He will not make loud arguments in the village pathways, but speak with humble dignity. He will not break a bruised reed. He will not snuff out a smoldering fire. He will never give up until all wrongs have been made right again. All nations will hear of his reputation and put their trust and hope in him." The prophet Creator will decide said this, "As I lay awake during the night, I was given many sacred visions. In one vision, I looked and saw what appeared to be a true human being. He was riding on the clouds of the world above and was brought into the council house of the Ancient of Days. He stood before the Ancient of Days and was gifted with great authority over all the earth, with honor that outshines the sun, with power that reaches beyond all the directions. All clans, tribes, nations, and languages will honor and serve this chosen one above all others. His chiefly rule will last beyond the end of all days, for it will be a good road that can never fade away or come to a bad end." After about 70 years in captivity, a small remnant returned to their homeland and rebuilt the sacred lodge. But the elders wept because it was pitiful in comparison to the original sacred lodge built by the great chief stands in peace. Many generations passed. Sacred ceremonies and feasts became empty rituals that were used to try to manipulate the Great Spirit, to do what the spiritual leaders wanted. The ceremonials and laws were used to control people and make them afraid instead of helping them. And many spiritual leaders became even more corrupt, and they complicated and twisted the true meaning of Creator's words. So the Great Spirit became silent and sent no more holy men to speak his words for 400 years. But he did not forget his ancient promises. Though the generations that followed, many powerful nations ruled over the tribes. The most recent was the people of Iron. This government took control of the tribes and dominated them for nearly 2 generations. The people of Iron forced their treaties on the tribes, but did allow some freedoms, and they could practice their own spiritual ways, build gathering houses called synagogues, and maintain a sacred lodge to perform their ceremonies and to make their prayers. This government also allowed them to have their own tribal chiefs. But over many years, the chiefs became corrupt and were controlled more by the ways of the people of Iron than by their ancient sacred ways. The people of Iron had taken charge of appointing their holy men and their tribal chief. The people were oppressed and feared this powerful government of the village of Iron, with its many soldiers and weapons of war. They kept praying that the Great Spirit would fulfill the age-old prophecies and send the chosen one, whom they hoped would be a great warrior chief, to destroy the people of iron and set them free. The right time had finally come for Creator to fulfill his ancient prophecies and send his chosen one. But he would not come in the way that the tribes had expected. You always get forced like 5 seconds. It's the poetic pause. You let it rest. You let it go. So first of all, what are some questions? What are some responses to what you just heard right there? Even folks coming in late, you didn't miss much. You were just, part of it is like there. What struck you the most, or what might have just been confusing? Whenever I lead a Bible study, I always have that, like, questions, observations, or objections.
We just went through 39 books in about 7 minutes.
And I loved all the different things, the way they described Rome, the Great Iron One, and the different, that was fascinating.
I like to watch television on the thing that I forgot the name of it, but and going through things that it's so reminded me with a guy with I'm going to be your best, and not he becomes a best for him, and it's this same, and I've even put together things about this thing that we're giving our country and rain or whatever they call it, and it sounds just maybe like there's under things happening just because they're full of power, and it cannot give it to the people, but I'll take it.
I think that should be must read by a lot of people because it was so concise and yet so appealing to hear more. You want to finish the story the way that was written, which is the whole Bible. But
Because I think the thing that we tend to forget, primarily because, like I was talking about earlier, we tend to be very right-sided of the brain, to use that old psychological term, right? Very alpha, or type 1 personality. We like to have things very concise, very logical, very reasonable. I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with that. Like a lot of that comes from the Platonist perspective. Plato. Just this. Very, very, very scholastic minded. So as a result, like I think we tend to look at Scripture very, almost as kind of as a tool for theology. We want to know, and that I don't think there's anything wrong with that, in and of itself. But I think we miss something. I think we miss something that's probably more psychologically relevant, because I think the whole point of this story, the whole point of like why do we learn it as a story? And I was talking like as introducing, like, why do we tell stories? Because the very act of telling a story makes you involved in the story. It's actually, in some ways, a story becomes incarnate when someone is telling it to you. Like we very much like the written word. Like that's kind of like how we've defined the West. It's like it's how we're powerful linguistically. We can jot things down. We have knowledge, right? And that's a good thing. But I think what happens, like so I mentioned this in the sermon last week, and it's important because ancient man didn't have that separation that we have about reading. Like we made reading very, very individualistic, which that did not exist. If you went to a library in ancient times, people were always reading out loud. There's actually a lot of letters from Seneca talking about how the Romans would have people committed if they were reading to themselves. They just reading the thing, like reading the text and not saying out loud. It was just common form until after the Middle Ages, to read it out loud. It's just what you did. There's actually in the book of Acts, we wonder, okay, why is this guy in a chariot reading this thing out loud? He's traveling along the, why is he reading that out loud? That's just what people did. That was just common thing. Well, we would miss that. We just kind of say, oh, there's just some guy, you know, riding a chariot, reading out loud. It's like, no, that was just the way that they did it. Why did they do it that way? Well, they did it that way because they believed that the words would become incarnate. Like when you're reading something from someone, they're actually coming back alive. Like humans were kind of, we're kind of built for that. When we think about how much times like we quote people, how many times that we like listen to people talk, there's something very important when people quote the words of others. We're just kind of built that way. We're just kind of, we just kind of do that. It's just because that's what's happening. That's really what this is about, is that like we actually are living this story that's described in the book right here. You know, we think about the New Testament. I think we usually, a lot of people, especially these days, you know, a lot of younger people assume like, well, religion is just something that people just kind of believe in, right? You know, you just kind of do it this way, that way. But I think, you know, just going a far more reductive, this notion that when we're following Jesus, when we go to church, we're actually playing out this part of the story. We're actually incarnating that story into our lives. So while we have a few minutes, I wanted to encourage some reflection. I was going to give homework last week, but that was I forgot about it. So, but something just to just to talk about like our last like 15 minutes here, you know, just to maybe an opportunity for some of us to share. What are some of the stories that define you? Like, what are some of these stories that help define you who you are? And I'll like, you know, and this doesn't have to be like terribly deep. You don't have to necessarily go into the epic of your life. There's plenty of opportunities for that. And I would encourage you to share that with as many people as you can. But I was thinking of like this story my aunt was telling me about my own life, you know, and I was just kind of thinking about like, well, one, just how humorous it was. So like I was probably around 3 years old and I'd been born. And my funny thing about both of my parents is that my mother's mother and my father's father, for some reason, and I know we don't know, like the beef is long buried because they've both been long buried, but like they hated each other for some reason. I don't know why. My aunts used the phrase specifically nemesis. Was the word, you know, that's how they thought of each other, nemesis. I think it was because my grandfather was part of the tribal government. He was like the village representative, you know, he was the guy, you know, that people talked to. And apparently she would always take him to task. Yeah, they were always the ones they were always fighting for some reason. And I said, I don't know why. I asked my dad about it. They don't know. I asked my aunt. They also didn't know. It was just something that was that way. So it was really surprising when my mother and my father got together, and you know, we were always joking. It was kind of like our own like little reservation Romeo and Juliet for some reason, you know. And that was kind of the thing. But part of like this story, part of the connecting point is that it was really, I'm just thinking back, the more I hear about it, the more it's really funny, because apparently those sides of the family did not like each other or did not esteem each other a lot, but they were always very much connected. So hearing these stories, it was like that. But my grandmother, my father's mother, just really, really loved me. Just really, really was always like, you know, as a baby, as an infant, she was the one that was always like taking care of me. And like, there was a time where I spent like 3 weeks with my grandparents and they just kind of didn't expect it. Like every time my aunt would go pick me up, it's like, oh no, we're not in, you know, we're not around, you know. But as we're kind of thinking of this, there was this story, you know, so I was around 3 years old, and you know, the weather can get pretty stormy, pretty bad, especially around this time of year. You know, thunderstorms just kind of come in, and it's South Dakota, so it kind of can form, you know, tornadoes that can form like that sort of, you know, weather. So these things happen very often, you know, but the thing is the land is so expansive, it's so big that most of the time the tornadoes just miss the town, you know, they just miss, you know, they go in one direction, they miss. This time there was one though, this time it didn't miss. And it was just like there, and then like, you know, the storm's coming through, and like whenever you're in a thunderstorm like that, they're not like the thunderstorms here, Like here, the thunderstorms, they last about like, 20 minutes, right? It gets dark. It's actually it's a pleasant experience. It rains really hard. There's some lightning, there's some thunder, the breeze comes through. And usually it's just nice and cool, right? By the end of the time. This is no, like the thunderstorm in South Dakota, you just see this huge wall of like, you see the white clouds just way up in the sky. You see the dark rain band. It's just like, it's pitch black. It's like night coming right at you. And then it just hits you. It just hits you. And then the rain comes and it blows. And it blows so hard that the rain actually comes in sideways. And the thing is that depending if there's a tornadic system, the rain will just hit the building harder. And so that was what was happening. You'll see like rain sheets. Like if you ever see like footage from like a hurricane, it's like that. But it's just localized. You'll see this rain just beating over. You'll see like the grass bending over, the trees will be like bent over, just bearing the wind of the storm. And so we're in our house, my grandmother's house, and like the wind, the windows are just are banging. The house is creaking and groaning as the winds hit, because everyone knew that it was like a tornado. It was like a, probably like, I think on the scale like an EF1, that's about 140, 150 miles an hour. The bigger scale is like, an F5, EF5, which is like 500 miles an hour. So that was like, that's pretty intense. It's more intense than a hurricane ever gets, like by an order of like 10 times. But like this was the smart one, but still the wind is just buffeting the house. And then my aunt told me, oh yeah, no, we were all in there. And then you were just like, my grandmother was a very religious woman, though lived in a different house, like, and my aunt was telling me, and my mom also told me this too, like the wind's buffeting the house, the rain is trying to, you just like, it's this howling sound. Because even a little bit of wind gets in through the doors, you just hear that, that incredibly howling, whistling sound. And when that happened, I just yelled out, "We need to pray." And so we did. And then the house, and the thing is that the tornado, it went south. It went south of the village. And the only house that got knocked over, it was a trailer. It was the only trailer that got knocked over, was my father's parents' house. Was the only house that was destroyed when the tornado came through. So apparently that made my grandmother just over the moon. My mother's mother, yeah, like his was the only one. Like the tornado caught it, like everyone saw it. They saw it like there. It was like it wasn't like locked down. It was just like on like the on the tires. So the tornado hit it, just flipped it around, and like just spread it all over the place. And she was very happy about that. Apparently for quite a while. But the thing is I was realizing that kind of story kind of tells a lot about me. It tells a lot about who I am, right? Even like as a 3-year-old, there was a strong spiritual connection, even when I was as small as that. So I think all of us, we have those stories that are like that. And most of us, I don't think we don't necessarily see them as valuable. Like we see them as kind of folksy, parochial, but I think those are important. We tell the story like, why did I do this blank job, right? Or why did I decide to move to Durango, Or why do I these sort of stories, they're pretty valuable. Mm-hmm. They're pretty valuable. And they're especially valuable to those who come after us, because they ground us. They ground us in where we come from. And that's important. That really is important, because we're used to thinking ourselves very individualistic. That's the other thing of that Platonist point of view, is that it's very, very much it's the individual. And I don't think there's, like I said, anything wrong with that in of itself. But I think it causes us to miss a lot of meaning. Like there's so many people, young people, that I'll meet in the course of my job, and they won't know where they come from. Yeah. They won't know the essence of their family stories. And I think that's some of the thing that's breeding a lot of the things like the mental health crisis, for example. Because, people ask me, like, how do natives do it, right? Like, how are natives still around, with all the troubles and trials and things that happen to them, right? And especially like if, untreated, my grandmother, the one that I mentioned, I think part of the reason that she was so opposed to my grandfather's, we're quite convinced, like we've looked at it, we're quite convinced she had undiagnosed bipolar disorder, for 50 years. And that would fit, that would follow a diagnosis. But she never got herself treated because her thought process was, that's just like, older timers, people from, that generation were like, no, like, only crazy people, are in the hospital, right? If you can deal with it, you just deal with it, right? So as a result, we're kind of looking back on our own misery and we're like, okay, that explains it. But a part of it is because, well, she knew a lot of these stories. She knew a lot of where she came from. People can deal as long as they know. But that's part of the thing, why we're seeing like all these crazy things happen. And I think the reason why is because they just don't have, there's no grounding. There's no sense of themselves outside of themselves. I've never met a Native person. I've never met any Native person, no matter how mentally ill or, just kind of not there in the head, who doesn't have at least some semblance of who they are. So as a result, I think that's why you have like Native people are so high functioning. I mean, obviously everyone needs help. Everyone, should go into treatment. That's a big thing that Native people are doing today. That's a big kind of a movement that people are doing, which is, I welcome that. But the hard part, but the thing is, I'm realizing, okay, that's why Western society is it seems to be destroying itself. It's just because people don't know. And usually when bad times happen, people actually begin to know. There's a thing, why did DNA testing, catch on so big in the last 5 years, right? Seems kind of insane, right? Okay, I'm gonna give this strange company my DNA. And conspiratorial thinking aside, I kind of think it's because people need to know where they came from, right? People need to know that. They want to know where they came from. I think it's important, So my encouragement to all of you is to think about that. Is I would encourage you all to tell part of your story, part of your story to someone, to share that, someone who hasn't heard it before. Because I think that's something that's a very blessing moment. That's a very, very blessing thing to do. Because that is how we engage. That is how we engage with this art. So there's this quote that I thought that was creativity is part of our humanness, right? But that's the thing. If God made the flowers, and they are worth painting and writing about. If God made the birds, they are worth the painting. If God made the sky is worth painting. If God made the ocean, indeed it's worth writing poetry about. It is worth man's while to create works upon the basis of great works that God has already created. So as I wrap this thought up, and then we'll just talk a little bit before we run out as we run out the clock. The thing is, God created each and every one of you. He created you. I think it's easy to forget that. It's easy to forget that God created you. And when we tell this story, whether it's related, I think all these stories are related. I was thinking about with my story, I never realized that Courtland was always going to be someone who prayed, even as a toddler, right? That's a thing, that's a connecting point. But that's different for everybody. It's everyone has their own gifts, their own gifting. And that when we tell that story, when we tell those stories of our lives, the things that mattered to us, the things that helped us make the decisions that we made, what we're doing is we're doing exactly what's there. Instead of painting, because not all of us have terribly. I mean, I paint, but I'm not very good. I just do it because I like it. But I realize I'm good at telling stories, and also encouraging other people to tell their stories. And when people tell their stories, wonderful things happen. Wonderful connection is built. People are desperate to hear it, And so that's my encouragement to you as it goes. It's not I would say it was a homework assignment, but there's gonna be a new person next week. So, that's my encouragement to you as we're kind of as the church is doing this season of creativity, and so there's no timeline, there's the next 3 months, as this is going. But I would encourage you to do that, to take some moment to tell that story right there. So what are some thoughts? What are some, as we're wrapping up our time here?
Courtland, it strikes me, we're talking about two different kinds of stories.
Mm-hmm.
The story you told about your own experience is a historical story. It's grounded in history. We could probably go back, based on your age, and identify that tornado that came through.
Mhm.
You know, we could go back and find some record of the destruction of that trailer.
Mhm.
The kind of mythic stories that you were alluding to earlier are ahistorical. They stand outside of history. And I think we as Christians tend to value the fact that our myths are grounded in history,
Mhm.
which makes, I think, Christianity different and unique from most, if not all, other religions, where their mythic stories are ahistorical. You know, they can't be identified. And that's important to us as Christians. So I think it's important to recognize there may be truth in myth,
Mhm.
but it's important also for us to be able to say, we know that Jesus of Nazareth was born at a certain time, that he died at a certain time. We have historical records. And he's not just a mythic creation that embodies some other truth.
Mhm. Exactly.
Well, I'm currently letting my niece and nephew, my brother was divorced when they were quite young, and I was pretty sure they had not heard any of the stories. So I've been telling them, even my ex-sister-in-law, what I know about her family.
Mhm.
I figured they can pass this on or not, you know, but it is your background. It's important, I think. Yeah, you know, they could probably remember back to 5, but I don't think anybody would be telling them these days. I was in a school system in my last job for years, and a lot of kids, even Native Americans, were sent away to schools and they don't have a clue. I said, don't you know anything?
Mhm.
And the other thing is there's a movie on TV occasionally called Australia with Nicole Kidman.
Mhm.
And one of the themes, a little boy is a narrator and he's Aboriginal.
Mhm.
And they keep talking about if he doesn't do this and that, he won't know his story.
Mhm.
So you hit it on the head. We
Mhm.
should all know our stories.
Mhm. Like we tend to not think it's valuable, right? We tend to not think because it's like, it is historic, right? It is in fact, you know, like even like our family story, right? Like you
Yeah,
can
that's
trace
the
those things
family
back, right?
stories, yeah.
But like the thing is like it's amazing how valuable it is. Because the thing is that no one else really knows it. We assume that people aren't interested. But I'm telling you that people will remember it. You know, like I'd encourage you to to remember those little details, you know, to pass those little details on. Because it's really like the value of it doesn't come forward in sometimes in your lifetime. Like what'll happen is that, and it'll happen like other people say, oh, so-and-so, aunt so-and-so, you know, uncle so-and-so said that's what happened, right?
Mhm.
And like, that's how oral tradition really happens. We tend to not value oral tradition. But as we wrap up, I was like, you know, the thing about the Bible is it wasn't actually written until the conquest. Most theologians, we know that that's true. Why? Well, because we're in the West, and because textual criticism, a lot of people didn't trust it. There was just like, people said, oh, like it was handed down orally, that can't be trustworthy. You know, it's like people are just saying it, right? But the thing is that people only wrote it down because they thought, they had no idea whether or not there actually would continue to be a tribe. They did not know whether or not there would continue to be an Israel after the Babylonian conquest. So Genesis, if we lived in those times, they would have heard it orally transmitted. That's just how they would have done it. They would have heard also most of Isaiah orally transmitted. They would have heard most of Job orally transmitted. You know, and even in Jesus's time, he also would have had those most orally transmitted. Like we think about the beginning of Luke, right? Jesus knows who he is. He knows what he's about. But still, he has them hand him the scroll, you know, of Isaiah, and he reads out Isaiah, right? It's like, I guess, I have come, you know, to declare good news, you know, to the prisoners, to this, you know, to do that. He says, it's now happened. But that's the thing, right? It's like, we make a big deal like, oh, he's reading it, but he's reading it in front of the congregation. And he's telling them all the story that they've heard their entire lives, that he is the God. And as a result, they try to push him off a cliff. You know, that was quite the... There's a lot of details like that, but part of it is like, you know, that's what we're doing, right? You know, it's like, you know, we're, you know, it's like our stories each, like as we do that, I encourage people to, you know, to pass them on, Because even if it seems mundane, if it seems boring, someone wants to know that on the first level. But I think it also ties us into our time. You know, it's like it ties us into where we come from, because it is easy to forget. You know, it is easy for things to be lost. And life is far better when it's not lost, but it also helps the people that come after us. So I think like as this kind of as the series is going to kind of keep going on, you know, next week other people, I think other people are going to kind of build on some of those themes, whether directly or indirectly, just because so much of the creative process, I love that quote right there. It's like creativity is central to our humanness. You know, if we are creative, it's very central to what we are. I would even say who we are, even if we don't necessarily consider ourselves particularly creative people. I think it's like, no, everyone's creative. You know, I think there's a lot of people that are very disciplined with their bodies. That's a creative act. You know, to be very fit, to exercise, that's a creative thing. Most people wouldn't consider it that. I think some people are very actively creative, like whether doing music right there, or telling stories, you know, or even like, you know, like doing things on their house, building like, you know, crafts right there. I say cooking really
Yeah,
is a very creative act right there, you know. Like everyone enjoys a good painting, but my gosh, people definitely prefer I've noticed that people definitely prefer more of a meal. So any other final thoughts as we just wrap this up?
I think it's fascinating to think about DNA being the story.
Mm.
And I've
Yeah.
never really thought about it because I know
Yeah.
pretty much my family history. So I've never really been curious as to where I come from. But I have friends and relatives who have discovered unknown half brothers and half sisters and things that they didn't know because of DNA testing. Put them in places. So there are some availabilities to stories that you didn't even think about.
Well, isn't it
Yeah.
cool with DNA? Like, you know, they keep showing these pictures online, but like they have like Napoleon's like great grandnephew looks exactly like him.
Yeah.
And then like the Duke of Wellington's great grandnephew. Apparently they're co-workers. You know, and they didn't know, but you know, you look at the painting, but you think about even just your own DNA, right? You look probably a lot more like your great grandfather, your great grandmother than you would ever think you would.
Yeah.
That's just how DNA works, right?
Well, I bumped into a guy at a church I was going to, and he had his DNA done, and he got a shock. He was like 92% Ashkenazi Jew. He had no idea. And now they're saying the same thing about Annie Oakley. Her
Mhm.
DNA was Jewish,
Mhm.
but she wasn't. But it's like a lot of people, you know, they show it on Finding Your Roots, all these actors, and it's fascinating what people don't know, and they should have been told. There are reasons, I suppose.
Well, I think a lot of it, you know, and part of the reason our ministry has a Bible like this, because there was this attempt to try to like, you know, get the Indianness out of people, right?
Yeah, take them away from their
But I think like the
families.
thing is that like, one thing that we learned, you know, is that, you know, people always ask like, so I have like so much, like one of my favorite quotes about it is like, oh, like I have a little bit of Indian blood, and the joke is, oh, what is it? Like, is it your pinky or your foot? You know, like, you know, what is that, right? Because we're used to compartmentalizing, right?
Yeah.
Like it's blank, but I think like, you know, it's the indigenous way that people, the indigenous way to view ethnicity really is like, oh, if you have that heritage, it is yours
Yeah,
because it's part of you, you know,
yeah,
and it's okay to reclaim that. And there's right ways to reclaim that, you know, and not just saying, oh, I have like a Indian princess in my gene line. That means nothing, you know. It's like, and because we didn't have princesses, so that's the first thing. But if you said, oh, like my grandmother was from, you know, like, you know, Snyder, Oklahoma, and they were like Choctaw, right? You're like, oh,
yeah.
that's a thing.
Yeah.
I've always wondered, not being in that situation myself, but you see on TV or other places on the news where this adopted person, part of a blind adoption, goes to great lengths to find out their history, their DNA, you know, what their birth mother is from, and, you know, their ancestry. And I always wondered why it was so critical for them to find out that whole piece of themselves, not just for health reasons or, you know, if there's cancer running in the family or whatever, but they want to find out, you know, where they came from, what their parents were like, you know, and all the way back. And then, you know, they finally meet up with, as these stories always go, they meet up with their birth mom, or maybe even just a sister that they didn't know they had. And it's this tearful gathering or meeting. And I've always kind of wondered about that, is why it's so important for people to understand their natural roots, instead of, why can't their life begin at adoption, you know, and just go from there.
Right.
And here's my, you know, adopted parents, and here's my family. But no, they go to great lengths, and it's a very emotional thing when they can discover their DNA roots.
Well, I think
Yeah.
even if it's negative, that's still part of the story. You know, because like there's always that example, right? Like, I mean, it's usually that there's the metaphor, right? It's like, okay, you have the guy who's like broken down, alcoholic, drunk on one side, and the man who's very successful, very well put together. And like they ask, like, why are you like this, right, to each other? And the answer is like, well, my father was an alcoholic. You know, so that, like, that's the thing, is that connective point, that point of choice is really important, because it tells you about who you are, right? It's like, I think that example of adoption is really important, because if someone had to give someone up, why, right? Was it just they weren't in the right headspace? Did they feel that they wouldn't be like a good, effective parent? Or maybe they just weren't able to, you know, maybe that was just like a mental health thing, right? But though that's still important to it. And even like, it's the thing, right? We have to, like, we tell our story, and we're wrapping up here. It's because we need to know all the details, even if it's sad. You know, because even if it's sad, that's enough. You know, we need to know that, and knowing that part, it's like, because there's a great insight that I love about the story. It's actually about the book of Job. It's like, what do Christians really believe? Well, we believe that all life is sacred. We believe that all life is sacred, even when it is sad.
Mhm.
That's the difference of our faith than everyone else's. Everyone else's, like, suffering is just an incidental thing, you know. It just happens, you know, and when we kind of know that's true. But because of Jesus's story, because of what we believe that the cross was all about, it all matters. It's all important. There was no part of our sadness, our suffering, our sorrow that doesn't intersect with the cross. That's why it's a cross. You know, it's like everything comes to it. Everything comes to it. Everything comes to it. It comes through it, and it comes around it. So that's the thing about it, is that's what we need to know. And that's why we need to pass down those storylines, because it tells us, it gives us the necessary details. People want to know that, like you said, you know, they want to know, like, was this a tragedy, or was this like, you know, maybe we'll be able to meet up with someone. People have that, yeah.
It doesn't even have to be monumental. It could be something like, they might be wondering, why do I have red hair?
Mhm.
And then they meet up with their birth family, and
It seems like it's more than that, though. It seems
yeah, it's
like
more, it's identity
it's
somehow.
like
Yeah.
when you find this whole other family that you didn't know you had, you immediately feel like a sense of belonging.
Yeah, there's connections, like
There's
with
connections.
talents and how you look. And
Yeah, it's like this person over here, you find out she's your natural sister, your genetic sister, and although you haven't spent a moment with them in your entire life, all of a sudden you're close to them. So what's that all about? You know, why are you close to this person that you don't know anything about, but you are now?
Well, and
You
you'll
might
get
have things in
there.
common, like a talent,
Mhm.
or the way you look, or just little things that aren't even necessary. Well, they might be DNA oriented, but mannerisms.
Mannerisms do pass on. That is one of those things.
Speech,
Right?
like I've got a lower voice,
Mhm.
you know.
Well, you ask any grandparent, you'll notice that, oh, they're doing things that I do.
Don't.
Or don't, is the thing, you know, or how they'll tell you things is also right up there.
But Ken, don't you think that part of that is an innate need to belong?
Yeah.
And where once we grew up in communities and lived our lives in those communities, now we are much more mobile. Whereas once people were connected through something like the church or even the, the benevolent order of the Elks. They had
Yeah.
community. But people today don't have community. I mean, in Durango, all the folks who have moved here from elsewhere and will live here for a few years and then move on somewhere else, I think we're sort of floating. And what you're describing, I think, is that innate desire to say, I belong.
Mhm. Yeah,
I would say if they have an adoptive family, they already belong. I mean, they're looking for something more than just that.
But what I'm suggesting is I think our society has changed, but most people have lost that sense of belonging.
yeah.
Well, you gotta
Well,
tell
certain-
people, you
certain
gotta
more
tell
moment.
people that you belong. And sometimes you gotta repeat it. But that's the point, is that's how we know our stories, is that the reason why, this is the final wrapping up, we've gone over time, blast it, pass it. I've actually, I do that a lot, it's how Indigenous people orient their time. It's not when you show up, it's when you leave. If you really don't like being like somewhere, you leave early. If you really like the people, you help clean up, it's just part of the thing. But yeah, I think that's the thing is that, the people that like it's the stories that they tell each other, the family stories of this, that. I think about mine, like I shared a little bit, it's part of the thing. So with that, I want to pray, just bless you and everyone who's on the recording.
Mr. Smith.
Yeah.
We've run into the thought the kids can't read our type of as my mothers or dads, they're all on the today. And they can't get the, what do we call it now, something says, but we all learn.
Right, script, like,
Yeah.
it's funny, that's a technological thing, because like, if you ever use a fountain pen, it's a lot easier to write with cursive. You write pretty fast. That's the reason that we do it.
And that's why they can't understand certain things, because kids are learning how to just do print.
Oh, yeah.
That's what they did.
Right, so that's the thing. Well, there are people who are working on on doing that, so I always tell people, you know how to write it, help the youngins. So
Yeah.
let me just pray blessings over us. Jesus, I just thank you for all that you've given us. I thank you that you've given each and every one of us, our stories, how you've interacted with that, the stories of our family, where we come from, but also your story, which our story comes through, which our story finds its full purpose, its full meaning, where you come into the story, and just how important that is. But also how, I just love how gentle you are. You're always guiding us. You're always with us. And that no matter where we're at, you're there. So I just pray blessings over each and every one of us, by each and every one who's traveling this week. And I just pray for opportunities in the coming weeks and months, just to share what we have, the lives that we've lived, the stories that we know, because that's important. That is just so important to the young people today. Young people today, and just people today in general, are in need of community. They're in need of community. They're in need of belonging. They're in need of their tribe. And the thing I love so much about your story, Jesus, the first 39 of the books, Lord, is that you're always there, and that you give purpose and meaning to the ways of the elders, and then to the ways of all of us living. So I just pray this all in your name, seal in your blood. May it be so. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Courtney.
Thank
That
you.
was totally wonderful.